The morning air was thick with salt spray and the rhythmic thud of boots on concrete. At Naval Special Warfare Command, the pace never slowed and the standards never dropped. Every piece of equipment had to be perfect, every detail scrutinized, because in the world of elite warriors, a single mistake could mean the difference between life and death. In a cramped supply room tucked away from the main training facilities, an old man worked in methodical silence. His movements were deliberate, practiced, almost meditative as he folded and inspected each parachute with the kind of precision that only comes from decades of experience. Harold Martinez was 73 years old, with hands that bore the calluses and scars of a lifetime spent working with his fingers. His hair had gone completely white, and his back carried a permanent curve from years of hunching over equipment tables. To the young SEALs who occasionally passed by the supply room, Harold was just part of the scenery. He'd been packing their parachutes for nearly 8 years, ever since he'd taken the civilian contractor position after his wife passed. The job kept him busy, kept his mind occupied, and most importantly, kept him close to the kind of men he understood. Men who knew what it meant to put everything on the line for something bigger than themselves. Harold never spoke unless spoken to, never offered opinions on training methods or equipment choices. He simply did his job with the quiet competence that had defined his entire life. The younger operators would drop off their gear with barely a glance in his direction, their minds already focused on the next mission, the next challenge, the next opportunity to prove themselves worthy of the trident they wore. But Harold didn't mind being invisible. In fact, he preferred it that way. Invisibility had served him well throughout his career, allowing him to observe, to learn, to understand, without drawing unwanted attention. He'd learned long ago that the most dangerous men were often the quietest ones, the ones who blended into the background until the moment they were needed most. This particular morning started like any other. Harold arrived at 0530, exactly as he had every weekday for the past 8 years. He unlocked the supply room door, flicked on the harsh fluorescent lights, and began his daily ritual of checking equipment logs and organizing the day's work. 3 teams would be conducting training jumps, which meant 36 parachutes to inspect, pack, and certify. The first interruption came at 0700 when a young SEAL burst through the door, his face flushed with exertion and barely controlled panic. The kid couldn't have been more than 25, all muscle and bravado, with the kind of confidence that came from surviving Hell Week, but hadn't yet been tempered by real combat experience. "Hey, old man," the SEAL barked, his voice carrying the edge of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "I need my chute checked again. Something doesn't feel right about the pack job." Harold looked up from his work table, his pale blue eyes meeting the younger man's with calm indifference. He didn't respond immediately, instead setting down the inspection checklist he'd been reviewing and walking over to examine the parachute in question. His fingers moved over the pack with the same methodical precision he applied to everything, checking connection points, feeling for proper fold tension, ensuring every safety mechanism was properly secured. "Pack job's fine," Harold said finally, his voice a low rasp that carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Tension's correct, pins are seated, reserves properly folded. She'll open clean." The young SEAL's face reddened with frustration. He wasn't used to being dismissed so casually, especially not by a civilian contractor who looked old enough to be his grandfather. In his world, respect was earned through physical prowess and proven combat performance, not through quiet competence in a supply room. "Look, Gramps," the SEAL said, stepping closer and lowering his voice to what he probably thought was an intimidating growl. "I don't think you understand. This is my life we're talking about. If that chute doesn't open because some old-timer got sloppy with his packing, I'm the one who's going to be a stain on the ground." Harold's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. A subtle straightening that suggested depths of experience the young man couldn't possibly comprehend. He'd heard variations of this conversation countless times over the years, from countless young warriors who confused age with incompetence, who mistook quiet professionalism for weakness. "Son," Harold said, his voice remaining calm and measured, "I've been packing chutes since before you were born. That parachute will open exactly when and how it's supposed to. I stake my reputation on it." The SEAL laughed, a harsh sound devoid of any real humor. "Your reputation? What reputation would that be exactly? Packing chutes for 8 years in a supply room? That's not exactly what I'd call a sterling military record." Other SEALs had begun to gather in the doorway, drawn by the sound of confrontation like moths to a flame. They formed a loose semicircle, their faces showing mixtures of amusement and curiosity. This was entertainment, a brief diversion from the monotony of equipment checks and training preparation. Harold felt their eyes on him, felt the familiar weight of judgment and assumption. These young men saw only what was in front of them, an elderly civilian contractor with weathered hands and a bent back. They couldn't see the years of service, the missions that were never officially recorded, the brothers lost in places whose names would never appear in any history book. "You know what I think?" the young SEAL continued, emboldened by his audience and Harold's continued silence. "I think maybe it's time for you to hang up the packing tools. Find yourself a nice retirement home where you can tell war stories to the other old-timers. Leave the real work to people who actually know what they're doing." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Harold felt something stir deep in his chest. Not anger exactly, but a profound weariness at the endless cycle of young men who confused confidence with wisdom, who mistook volume for authority. He'd seen it countless times before, in countless different contexts, and he knew how these confrontations usually ended. But this time felt different somehow. Maybe it was the accumulation of 8 years of being treated as furniture, or maybe it was the particular smugness in the young SEAL's voice. Whatever the reason, Harold found himself making a decision he'd avoided for nearly a decade. He reached up slowly, deliberately, and loosened the collar of his work shirt. The movement was subtle, barely noticeable, but it exposed a small section of his neck that had been hidden beneath the fabric. There, etched into the weathered skin just below his hairline, was a tattoo so faded it was almost invisible. The ink had blurred with age and sun exposure, but the design was still recognizable to anyone who knew what to look for. It was a trident, but not the familiar SEAL trident these young men wore with such pride. This was older, more primitive, surrounded by symbols that predated the modern special operations community by decades. The craftsmanship was rough, clearly done by hand in field conditions, and the placement suggested it had been applied with ceremony rather than casual decoration. None of the gathered SEALs noticed the tattoo. Their attention was focused on the confrontation playing out before them, waiting to see if the old man would finally crack under the pressure of their collective disdain. They had no idea they were looking at a piece of living history, a relic from an era when special operations meant something entirely different. When missions were conducted in absolute secrecy and operators were expected to disappear completely if captured. Harold let his collar fall back into place, covering the tattoo once again. The decision was made. For 8 years, he'd been content to remain invisible, to let his past stay buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and classified documents. But something about this moment, this particular combination of arrogance and ignorance, had awakened something he'd thought was long dead. The young SEAL was still talking, still making his case for why Harold should be put out to pasture, when the supply room door opened again. This time, the footsteps that entered were different, measured and purposeful, in a way that immediately commanded attention. Commander Bradley Morrison had been walking past the supply room when he heard the raised voices, and something about the tone of the confrontation had made him pause. Morrison was a career Navy man, 48 years old, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent in harsh environments. He'd commanded SEAL teams in 3 different theaters, and he'd learned long ago to pay attention when his instincts whispered that something wasn't quite right. The scene that greeted him as he stepped through the doorway was familiar enough. A cluster of young SEALs surrounding an older civilian contractor, their body language suggesting the kind of casual intimidation that sometimes passed for humor in military circles. But there was something about the old man's posture that caught Morrison's attention, a stillness that seemed less like submission and more like coiled potential. "What's the situation here?" Morrison asked, his voice cutting through the chatter with the kind of authority that came naturally after years of command. The gathered SEALs immediately straightened, their casual arrogance evaporating in the presence of superior rank. The young SEAL who'd been leading the confrontation, Petty Officer Collins, stepped forward with the eager enthusiasm of someone who believed he was about to be vindicated. "Sir, I was just expressing concerns about the quality of equipment maintenance. This contractor seems to think his packing job is above reproach, but I'm not comfortable trusting my life to someone who might not be up to current standards." Morrison's gaze shifted to Harold, taking in the man's calm demeanor and the way he continued working despite the crowd of operators surrounding him. There was something familiar about the old contractor, something that nagged at the edges of Morrison's memory like a half-forgotten dream. "Mr. Martinez, isn't it?" Morrison said, reading the name tag on Harold's workshirt. "How long have you been packing chutes for my teams?" 8 years, sir," Harold replied, his voice steady and respectful without being deferential. "Never had a malfunction that wasn't operator error," Collins scoffed audibly. "Sir, with respect, that's exactly what someone would say if they were trying to cover up their mistakes. Maybe it's time we got someone younger in here, someone who can keep up with modern packing techniques." Morrison studied the young SEAL's face, seeing the mixture of genuine concern and barely concealed contempt that seemed to define his generation's relationship with anyone over 50. These kids had grown up in an era of rapidly advancing technology, where last year's equipment was considered obsolete and experience was often viewed as a liability rather than an asset. But Morrison had been around long enough to know that some kinds of knowledge couldn't be downloaded or learned from a manual. The old contractor's hands moved with the kind of fluid precision that only came from decades of repetition, and there was something in his eyes that suggested depths of experience these young operators couldn't even imagine. "Mr. Martinez," Morrison said, "mind if I ask about your background? Your personnel file is surprisingly thin for someone with your level of clearance." Harold paused in his work, his fingers stilling on the parachute cord he'd been inspecting. For a moment, the supply room fell completely silent, as if everyone present sensed they were approaching something significant without quite understanding what it was. "Most of my service record is classified, sir," Harold said finally. "Standard procedure for certain types of operations." Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. In his 26 years of military service, He'd encountered that particular phrase only a handful of times, always in connection with operations so sensitive that even their existence was considered a state secret. The kind of missions that produced operators who disappeared into civilian life afterward, carrying secrets that would die with them. Collins, however, was unimpressed by what he clearly viewed as an old man's attempt to seem important. Classified service record? Come on, Gramps. What did you do, guard supply depots in the rear echelon? Maybe process paperwork for real operators? The other SEALs chuckled nervously, but Morrison noticed that Harold's expression hadn't changed. If anything, the old man seemed almost amused by the young operator's assumptions, as if he'd heard similar dismissals countless times before and found them more tiresome than insulting. Morrison took a step closer, his command instincts fully engaged now. Something about this situation was setting off every alarm bell he'd developed over the course of his career, and he'd learned to trust those instincts implicitly. "Mr. Martinez," he said quietly, "would you mind stepping over here for a moment?" Harold set down his tools and walked over to where Morrison stood near the door, moving with the kind of careful economy of motion that suggested old injuries imperfectly healed. As he approached, Morrison caught sight of something that made his breath catch in his throat. There, just visible above the collar of Harold's work shirt, was a small section of what appeared to be a tattoo. The ink was so faded it was barely distinguishable from the surrounding skin, but Morrison's trained eye caught the distinctive curve of what looked like part of a trident design. Not the modern SEAL trident he knew so well, but something older, cruder, with lines that suggested it had been applied in field conditions rather than a professional tattoo parlor. Morrison's mind raced through the implications. Tattoos like that were almost mythical in the special operations community, spoken of in whispers among the most senior operators. They belonged to units that had existed in the shadows of official military history, conducting operations so classified that most of their records had been destroyed or buried so deep in government archives that they might as well not exist. The young SEALs were still watching the exchange with varying degrees of interest and impatience, completely unaware that they might be standing in the presence of a living legend. Collins, in particular, seemed eager to resume his campaign to have Harold removed from his position, his face showing the kind of frustrated arrogance that came from being temporarily silenced by superior authority. Morrison made a decision that would change everything. Rather than continuing the conversation in front of the assembled operators, he turned to address the group as a whole. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute command, "I need everyone except Mr. Martinez to clear out of this supply room immediately. Return to your scheduled training activities and await further instruction." The SEALs began to file out reluctantly, their curiosity clearly piqued by the unexpected turn of events. Collins lingered near the door, his face showing a mixture of confusion and indignation at being dismissed just as he'd thought he was gaining the upper hand. "Sir," Collins said, "if there's a problem with equipment maintenance, shouldn't the team leaders be involved in addressing it?" Morrison's gaze fixed on the young operator with the kind of intensity that had ended more than one military career. "Petty Officer Collins, when I want your input on personnel matters, I'll ask for it. Until then, you have training to complete. I suggest you focus on that, rather than questioning the competence of people whose service records you're not cleared to review." The dismissal was absolute and final, delivered with the kind of quiet authority that brooked no argument. Collins's face flushed red with embarrassment and suppressed anger, but he knew better than to push back against a direct order from a commander. He turned and stalked out of the supply room, followed by the remaining SEALs, who cast curious glances back over their shoulders as they departed. When the last of them had gone, Morrison closed the door behind them and turned back to Harold, who had resumed his methodical work on the parachutes, as if nothing unusual had happened. The silence stretched between them for several long moments, heavy with unspoken questions and the weight of secrets that might be about to emerge from decades of carefully maintained obscurity. Morrison walked over to where Harold stood at his work table, studying the old man's profile in the harsh fluorescent light. Up close, he could see the fine network of scars that crisscrossed Harold's hands and forearms, the kind of marks that spoke of intimate familiarity with violence and danger. There was also something in the way Harold held himself, a coiled readiness that suggested reflexes honed by experience most people couldn't imagine. "Mr. Martinez," Morrison said quietly, "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about exactly who you are and what you did before you started packing parachutes for my teams." Harold's weathered hands stilled on the parachute fabric, and for the first time in 8 years, he allowed himself to meet a superior officer's gaze with the full weight of his own authority. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the recognition that some secrets were too dangerous to remain buried forever. "Commander," Harold said, his voice carrying a quiet dignity that had been hidden beneath years of deliberate invisibility. "Some stories are classified for good reason, but I'll tell you this much. Every chute that leaves this room has been packed by hands that understand exactly what it means when they don't open." Morrison nodded slowly, understanding that he was looking at a piece of living history, a ghost from an era when special operations meant something entirely different. The young SEALs outside would continue their training, never knowing they owed their lives to skills learned in places that didn't exist on any official map. Sometimes the most dangerous warriors are the ones who choose to serve in silence, carrying the weight of classified valor in their hearts, rather than on their chests. Harold Martinez had spent 8 years proving that heroism isn't always loud, and that the truest measure of a man isn't found in the stories he tells, but in the quiet competence with which he serves those who follow in his footsteps.